Yeah.
This is the January meeting for Tabletop Minions. I'm going to go with a quick presentation about primer. According to Wikipedia, I have this printed out, a primer is a preparatory coating put on materials before painting. Priming ensures better adhesion of paint to the surface, increases paint durability, and provides additional protection for the material being painted. The term primer comes from the Latin primus, meaning first, because it precedes the other coatings. So really, what is primer? It's a paint-like product that allows normal paint to stick better to a surface than if it were used just on the surface alone. Primers are going to help not only in adhesion of paint, but also they're going to help on, say, metal miniatures. They're going to help to protect the metal itself. Over time, metal miniatures, these days predominantly made out of like pewter and tin and alloys like that, can actually start to, if just left unpainted, can actually start to rot. Not quite rust, but they'll get real kind of brittle and stuff like that. So primer is a good step for metal miniatures anyway. Since primers don't need to have durable surfaces because they're the thing that's going to get covered by something else, they can be kind of chemically designed to be a little bit more tacky and sticky and porous so that paint can stick to it better and it doesn't have to have a decent surface. So one of the main things about primer is going to be that you're not going to get a glossy primer. It's always going to be porous. It's always going to be kind of matte because the paint has to have something to soak into. So why do you use it? Like I mentioned, on metal, it causes the paint to adhere directly to the miniature a little bit better and also helps protect from oxidization for the different type of metal you might use. On plastic miniatures, something like this, primer isn't usually necessary. There's a lot of people out there who paint directly onto plastic. Some people who use the newer paints from, say, like Games Workshop, the foundation paints, will paint directly on the plastic. But one of the reasons why you'd want to prime is because usually plastics are in a certain color. Might be like a white or a gray or something along those lines. And if you want to have the color be black and you want to have a darker paint that goes over it, you're going to want to be able to prime ahead of time and then paint, as opposed to having to put layer after layer of paint to try to cover up the underlying color. So that's a good reason to prime with plastics. I still just prefer to always prime even plastics just because I think the paint's going to stick better in the long run. So color. What color do you go with? It's kind of a personal preference, but there are reasons and guidelines for which colors kind of are going to work best. So black, like this, is going to work best on soldiers and orcs and any kind of darker kind of figure. One of the bonuses to it is that you're going to have the black color kind of add a shadow in any spot where you don't happen to get paint. Underneath the arm, you know, if you sprayed all this stuff and you're painting and you don't quite get underneath the arm, well, you've just basically created a shadow by leaving that part black. So there's nothing wrong with that. A lot of people also like to do something known as black lining. If I was a miniature, you'd paint this part skin color and you'd paint this part shirt color, and right in between they'll leave sometimes a little thin black line, almost like an outline in a cartoon. Some people prefer that style. Well, it's a lot easier to do if you've got a black base to start with. So other people will use white. A lot of times white is used for things that are going to be a lighter colored miniature. If you're going to be using painting some elves, or if you're going to be painting, you know, monks like in kung fu robes and that kind of stuff. If you're going to be painting female warriors who always have like barely any kind of armor on and they're mostly all skin, you're going to want to have a light color to be able to paint on top of. If you have a black miniature and you have to paint it real light, flesh tone, it's going to take layer after layer after layer. The more layers you have to paint, the longer it takes, the more paint you waste, and also the more likely you are to fill in detail. So that's another reason why you would work with, say, white. There's also gray. It's kind of a middle ground, obviously. If the things that you're going to be painting are going to have some light and some dark, you could go with gray. For some reason, people don't seem to prefer gray. They either like to go with black or white, and I don't know why that is, but they do. There are also now colored primers. This is a skeleton bone color. These are a bit more expensive usually, but they're going to be matched to certain colors. So if you're going to paint a whole bunch of skeletons, rather than painting them all white, and then going back and painting them all bone color, and then going from there to the next step, you can both prime and color them in the same spray. Now, like I said, usually a bit more expensive. I think this can here is $15 and it's 400 milliliters, but it saves you a step. So, and they come in blues and greens and browns and all kinds of different colors. The differences between sprays and brush-ons. One big difference between spray and brush-on is that spray is obviously a bit more dangerous. It's a bit smellier. You don't want to necessarily do it in your house. But on the other hand, if you have a whole bunch of stuff to spray all at once, or to try to prime all at once, it's a lot easier to spray it all than to sit there and try to paint every single one of them with a brush-on primer. Now, if you just want to paint one guy because you're working on a guy that you're going to use in your role-playing game and that's going to be your guy or whatever, you don't want to have to break out, you know, all the newspaper and the spray cans and the ventilation just to spray paint one guy. So then, in those situations, a brush-on primer can be a good idea. One of the other downsides to brush-on, sometimes if you do it too thick, you'll fill in little pieces of detail. So spray, you don't have that as long as you do it right. But spray also sometimes doesn't last as long. If it's been sitting on the shelf for 2 years, it's probably bad. You'll notice because you'll spray and you'll get like a dust that will kind of stick and sort of brush off of your figure, and that never works real well. So that's kind of something to watch out for with sprays. If you haven't painted in a while and you've got some primers, you may need to get new primer versus trying to spray it on something and then trying to get it off again with some sort of stripping compound to get the primer that does actually unfortunately stick. Another thing that people are starting to see, that I'm starting to see online, that people are starting to use is something called Gesso. It's Gesso. It is a coating that fine art painters usually use to put on canvas before they start painting. It protects the canvas from, say, oil paints, because oil paints over time, the acids will eat the canvas. So a Gesso is something you can go to your local art supply store and buy a big tub of it, and then you can work with it from like that. But you can get smaller tubs as well, which is probably more useful in this situation. That stuff you can just kind of slop on, and these days Gesso is made out of acrylic. And the acrylic will have a tendency, when it dries, to kind of tighten, so it won't fill in too much detail. Gesso is cheaper than this little tiny bottle here of acrylic normal primer was $3.30, whereas I can get a tub the size of a pop can of Gesso that will cost about $4. So, and sometimes that's a better idea for you, but your mileage may vary. I've read stuff from people who are thinning it a little bit with distilled water, people who are painting it on direct. I mean, you kind of have to play with all of these different things, or at least some of them, to find what you like the best. You can get something that's a specific color, is designed specifically for your army. You can go to your local hobby store or game store and spend up to $15 for a normal can of spray paint. Or you can do what I do a lot of times and go to the automotive store. This is Dupli-Color Sandable Primer, and you go to the automotive store like Advanced Auto Parts, and you buy this stuff, 400 milliliters, for about, I think I paid less than $6. And I really like the surface on this for painting. But you kind of have to do a little bit of discovery to figure out, well, I like this kind of paint, or I like that kind of paint. I prefer to spray. You know, I live in an apartment, so spraying is kind of a pain. I can pretty much only do it in the summer and the spring and a little bit of the fall, because I don't have a basement or a garage. If you've got a basement or a garage with good ventilation, then you can prime pretty much all year round if you're using spray primer. And if there's situations where you just want to paint one figure, then a little jar of primer that you brush on is going to work probably pretty well. So that's about it as far as primer is concerned. I'll probably put something on the website, on the message board, and other people can talk about their experiences with primer and that kind of stuff. I know that some people use airbrushes for primer. I've been kicking around that idea myself. There's also a lot of different websites that talk about tutorials about primer and things that you can learn about. I've even seen stuff where they've had a bunch of different primers all painted on the same piece of metal, and then they've, you know, rubbed on it with like toothbrushes to see which one has the best adhesion and things like that. So there's a lot of stuff you can find out there on the internet about primer and what's going to work best for you for your particular application.